to introduce Dr. Nasar Meer. I'm particularly pleased because I've been collaborating with him one way or another on different projects without ever having met him. So this was a very exciting thing to actually meet the person. And I think one can say that he's an up-and-coming star in the field of sociology, multiculturalism, race relations, and things like that. He's recently edited a special issue of Ethnic and Racial Studies, to which I contributed. And this isn't even mentioned in this blurb of his. He's a reader and co-director of the Center of Civil Society and Citizenship at Northumbria University. He's held fellowships in all kinds of amazing places, from Harvard to Edinburgh to our house. And he's edited several books and written his own book, which is called Citizenship, Identity and the Politics of Multiculturalism, published by Palgrave, which you can buy for 50% discount. And I'm also told to remind everyone, in case you didn't know, that he recently was interviewed on Radio 4.
I didn't tell you to remind everyone.
No. Farzana told me to remind everyone.
Thank you for that.
About this particular event?
Yeah, on Thinking Aloud.
Oh, so there you go. So you've got whatever. I'm a little bit confused about the program. So as chair, I shouldn't be confused. But you have about, let's say, 45 minutes.
Okay. I won't need that long. Probably you'll be pleased to hear I only need about half an hour. Well, first of all, thank you. Well done for staying and making it through the course of what is a long and a hot day. I think it's been an excellent series of papers and it's been a real privilege to be part of it. My thanks very much to Farzana, Monica and Brulent for the invitation in the first place, and moreover for not retracting the invitation when I sent them my abstract, which has very little to do with Britishness per se, but addresses it indirectly. Because really my starting point for this paper is to register that while there's now quite a burgeoning literature on ear infection? No, you won't speak louder. Quite a burgeoning literature on Scottish national identity, on nationalism, or nationalist politics, as both a kind of a mass and an elite phenomenon. We don't really know where ethnic and racial minorities come to rest in these debates. And some people say this is self-evident because obviously the numbers are smaller in Scotland. When we think about the total number of ethnic minorities in Scotland, you know, we're somewhere around 4% compared to about 10% of England and Wales. Okay, well that's kind of one explanation. Another is that minorities in Scotland haven't become politicised in a way that's comparable to England. So there haven't been, race riots, there haven't been great controversies about minority claims making. And I suspect, actually, those two feed into one another. But nonetheless, it strikes me that at a time when all political parties in Scotland are jockeying over a vision of the nation, looking at where ethnic minorities come to rest in these debates is one means of interacting what are often disparate literatures on multinationalism and multiculturalism. That's a religious breakdown. But I want to kind of narrow this further, ideally. And I want to focus on the even lesser known question of where elite political actors are locating minorities within their projects of nation building. And drawing on some empirical data, namely interviews with members of the Scottish Parliament, senior civil servants, journalists, some intellectuals, I think there are three predominant clusters in how they're going around locating minorities within the project of Scottish nationhood. And I say there are three clusters. One I call an aspirational pluralism. I'll elaborate what these are in the course of the paper. Secondly, I think there's something going on in the way in which these elite political actors are understanding empire and the way in which they see difference as historically familiar because of Scotland's role in empire. And thirdly, there's a kind of an anxiety, a sense that there need to be limitations on integration in terms of the kinds of accommodations that Scotland can make, and I'll elaborate what I mean by that before offering some conclusions. Okay, so the first question I suppose is, can multiculturalism trust in multinationalism? Can multiculturalists subscribe to the view that multinationalism is in the interest of multiculturalism too? Well, some people argue probably. People here, I would include the late Sir Bernard Crick, who would often say that the story of multicultural Britain needs to be rested in this wider account of historical multinational diversity. Bhikkhu Parekh, in a similar way, has shared something of this in the past. I'm not sure if he entirely coheres with it today. But I have a quote here from the late Bernard Crick. I won't read it all out, just one part of it, I think it's relevant. When we interviewed him in 2007 on a project looking at, actually, the Home Office's porting over of citizenship education from the Department of Education to the Home Office. We were quite interested in that journey. And the question I kind of posed to him, well, to what extent was your interest in citizenship education informed by multiculturalist ethic? Were you, for example, building on the Swan Report? Were you very alive to those questions in the debate? And he would say, well, look, I've given you a very good argument. And he's talking now about a kind of an ideal conversation he's had or has had, ideal conversation he may have had in his mind or has had with Tariq and Bhikkhu Parekh in the past. He says, I've given you a very good argument, but also a historical truth, that Scots did not lose their culture, the Welsh likewise, even language. It's a very good argument for people who think that national identity would be destroyed if you don't have assimilation. Okay, so multinationalism, historical multinationalism, in this case the union of parliaments between Scotland and England, hasn't led to the diminution of cultural recognition. Moreover, it's a path in which minorities can come to rest. That's one view, probably. Another view is that, well, there probably aren't any guarantees, to be honest. Because even though multiculturalism and multinationalism come together in challenging this idea of a monocultural nation-state and encourage the right of cultural recognition, linking these to social equality and protection from discrimination, it seems to be the case that since 2001, where there has been a multinational accommodation, that hasn't necessarily lent itself to recognising immigrant minorities. And this is Will Kinlicker reflecting on an argument he used to make. Kinlicker famously said, well, look, we can put together First Nations, we can put together immigrants, and we can put together settler nations together in this rubric of multiculturalism. And he's come to kind of reflect on that and perhaps even reject that to some extent. To the extent that he says, well, look, there are now no longer any guarantees. And he's got Quebec in mind when he's talking about this. He's saying countries with an inherited ethos of accommodation in relation to old minorities are not predestined to be inclusive of new minorities. There's no inherent tendency for the former to spill over into the latter. And of course, we can point to some examples of this. Because in a number of cases, these perspectives not only have not come together, but have led to some kind of problematic hierarchy insofar as established nations have been able to set the terms of inclusion for newer minorities. I think much of the debate over interculturalism actually captures it, especially as expressed in Quebec, Catalonia and Flanders, insofar as it's stated by the interculturalists that each of these minority nations has a distinct public space into which minorities should be expected to integrate and identify with. Now, what strikes me as particularly interesting is that while in Scotland too, these questions of multinationalism and multiculturalism have managed to fire past each other, a phrase by David McCrone, there's this kind of self-evident rejoicing that whatever else is going on in Scotland, it's impeccably civic. It's a big tent national identity. Here's Lee Searle's description that whatever else is going on in Scotland, we can agree, there is a consensus that we're forging a multicultural, multi-ethnic society. Scottishness is predicated on a very inclusive sense of identity. Now, I find this especially interesting because, as I said, political actors of all hues are kind of jockeying over this vision of an identity, and Scottish identity. And I just put up this quote from Angus Fraser, who is the leader of the SNP bloc in Parliament. And I put this one up because it's particularly provocative, because he, as an SNP politician, adopts a post-colonial frame. He says, there was a time when lots of Australia, Canada, Ireland, they were all run from London. But once they've thrown off the shackles of empire, once they've thrown off this colonial yoke, they've forged ahead and done incredibly well. And I find that quite interesting, and I put it up just because it's provocative. But remember, the SNP isn't the only nationalist party in Scotland. the Scottish Liberal Democrats, Scottish Labour, the Scottish Conservative and Unionist Party, the Scottish Greens. Everybody's got their hands on a national project. Historically, when the Conservatives in the late 90s opposed devolution, they became presented as being anti-Scottish, and no political party wants to make that mistake again. And forever, Conservatives have been locked out of Scottish politics. But this isn't just an elite phenomenon. There's something going on in terms of a popular mass appeal. And this isn't just in terms of chasing Nigel Farage out of Scotland because he's so anti-Scottish self-governance. It's in terms of how people self-identify. Look at the top column. When people are asked, and this is the survey equivalent of hitting somebody over the head with a blunt instrument and saying, what's the best identity for you? But nonetheless, they're helpful in some respects. You find that in the rest of the United Kingdom, British has a really important traction, but not in Scotland. 3/4 of people insist that they're Scottish first, and then the rest splinter. So this isn't just an elite activity. There is something going on at a mass level. So why then elites, and why not everyday political activists? Why elites and not everyday kind of politics? Well, the truth is the project as a whole has taken in civil society organisations. I've done quite a bit of work with Bemis and GARA, which is the Glasgow Anti-Racist Alliance. So I'm working with non-elite actors. I've also done quite a bit of public and media discourse analysis. Is it discourse analysis? Is it content analysis? Where's Elizabeth Poole? She could probably answer that question. But nonetheless, let's assume that I didn't. Let's assume that I focused solely on elite political actors. Well, why did I do that? Well, it's said that over the last 15 years, a distinct political class has emerged. And interestingly, in Keating and Kearney's study, they find that this doesn't necessarily break with what's gone before, but rather that devolution has accelerated the trend towards professional middle class leadership. But what their account, I think, leaves entirely untouched is how these political elites think about minorities. And of course, there's a lovely phrase from Tom Nairn where he talks about elite political actors in Scotland inviting the masses into history. What do I mean by that? Well, it's no accident that the referendum vote in 2014 is on the 700th anniversary of the Battle of Bannockburn, when Robert the Bruce saw the English. When Alex Salmond talks in biblical language, set my people free. Renaming the Scottish executive in the devolution settlement to the Scottish government, kind of protecting Gaelic as a national language, which is a recent innovation, only in 2005. Gaelic isn't a Scottish language, it's a West Coast language. So elite political actors are kind of busily inviting the masses into history. And what I suppose really frustrates me is that we've all kind of gone to the problem, we've all gone to the subject when we do social science inquiry, and I think that's quite right. But we all agree that elites matter. Yet we've somehow kind of slipped away from focusing and investigating and spending time on them and kind of researching them. And there are good methodological reasons for that. It's often hard to get access. Often we want to go to the implications. But when we all complain about the city, there are very few studies I can think of very few studies that have actually done any research with bankers or kind of gone down to the city and kind of gone to that elite end. We've kind of looked at the implications of it further downstream. Okay, so who did I interview? Well, I interviewed members of the Scottish Parliament. I tried to get a gender balance across the lot. I didn't quite manage that. I've kept the Scottish Green Party respondent gender neutral because there's one man and one woman. I interviewed one of them. I also tried to interview the people who might think of as politics facilitating occupations. So these include journalists, lobbyists, barristers, financiers, and amongst others. And they're precisely some of the elites who emerge in more diffuse conceptions of nationalism in the nationalism studies literature. Okay, so on to some thematic findings. So what did I find? Well, I said there were these three tendencies. What did I mean by aspirational pluralism? Here I mean there's a consensus across unionists and independents that a civic and not ethnic nationhood is underway, but for different reasons. Secondly, difference is historically familiar. Here I find that respondents say that good and bad experiences of empire kind of make them, to some extent, function as a bit of a prophylactic. And they have a history of being a nation shaped by both sending and receiving. And thirdly, I talked about boundaries for integration. There's a real hesitancy amongst my respondents to recognise too much multilingualism or multifacetism in case it unpacks civil peace. So let's have a look at that in some more detail. So there's a historian, Tom Devine, who's proposed that we can understand an incremental self-confidence expressed by political elites in Scotland as an aspirational nationalism. And this he allies to a broader social transformation and cultural renaissance that parallel devolution and a shift from a service-based economy and shift to a service-based economy. And the key question for us is whether this aspirational nationalism also includes an aspiration for pluralism. And I think here two particular frames emerge. The first is that being part of a historical multinational settlement has functioned to service Scotland with a particular kind of tolerance. So this is a response from a Scottish Green MSP, my own Scottish Green MSP. Scotland is inherently a multinational, multi-ethnic, multilingual, multicultural entity. And therefore, an attack on multiculturalism is almost an attack on Scotland. Another response is from a Liberal Democrat who says, well, look, if you look down Scotland's history, we have a proud tradition of assimilating, quote-unquote, waves of different groups in a way that sustained a population in many communities. And I think that's led to a far more diverse and vibrant and interesting cultural mix than when people were perhaps a little more static in the communities and regions of their birth. So this idea that Scotland's diversity within a historical register of multinationalism can be tested. It's a hypothesis. And we can test it in this way. When we survey the attitudes of Scottish majorities to claims making by minorities, we find a small but consistent ethnic penalty, which is different in Scotland to England. And by that I mean that it's marginally more the case in Scotland than it is in England, that Scottishness possibly equates with being white. So residence in Scotland is deemed to be a weak claim on national identity. But when we add markers like accent and also parentage, people are more willing to accept a claim from a minority. And the key figures in this table really are the bottom one. This is the difference between Scotland and England. So these are percentages. So there's a kind of an 8% deficit. So if when the survey question is asked, what do you need to be Scottish? The difference here between non-white is 8%. All right. Well, what if you're non-white and you have a national accent? You have a Scottish accent. Well, people in Scotland are a bit more willing to accept you. But what if you're non-white? You have a national accent and you have Scottish parents. Okay, well that's the real kind of threshold for inclusion. But of course that begins to assume a degree of family inheritance, or what we'd call ethnicity to some extent. Now, what should we make of that? Well, it's worrying, isn't it, that there's a disproportionately higher rejection rate in Scotland than there is in England. But we need to offset that with the fact that ethnic minorities in Scotland are much more likely to self-define as Scottish than ethnic minorities in England are likely to self-define as English. So it's prominently the case that minorities in Scotland will say, I'm Chinese Scottish, or I'm Scottish Chinese, I'm Scottish Muslim. That's not the case in England. People will say, oh, I'm British Muslim, or I'm British Chinese, I'm British African Caribbean. So there's a sense of ownership that minorities have in Scotland over the nation, which is interesting, I think. And this leads into a second kind of trope within this first register, is aspirational pluralism. Because here, it seems like elite political actors claim that they have cast nationalism in an inclusive mould. A couple of interesting quotations here. Without patting ourselves on the back too much, this is to the credit of the Scottish Parliament. The SNP and Labour have held the line here. They haven't engaged in ethnic boundary making. Another SNP actor says, and that's from Labour, another SNP actor says, we've captured nationalism. We've made it something positive, made it civic. That's been 8 decades of work. It doesn't just happen overnight. So how accurate is that view? Well, we might point to political speeches. We might point to the fact that Alex Salmond has frequently said that Scotland's not Quebec. that Scotland, unlike Quebec, follows a path of civic nationalism. All right. We might think about the way in which policy documents emphasise a particular phraseology. They talk about all the people of Scotland rather than Scottish people. Okay, that's another illustration. But in many respects, what's most interesting to me is that this is even an aspiration. And it marks Scotland in contrast with other minority nations. When you think of the Quebecois, when you think of the Basques, when you think of the Catalonians, they all have real difficulty with drawing the boundary more broadly. You know, there's an instrumental logic to this, right? Elites have a powerful incentive to recruit minorities into their national projects, both to disprove charges of ethnic exclusion, but also to build a national consensus. It seems self-evident that in terms of realpolitik, it's better to draw the boundary around as many as possible, better to have people inside the tent if one's trying to govern. So I said that the Basques have a problem with this. Until recently, you had to show that you had 4 grandparents of Basque parental origin to be a member of the Basque National Party. Pauline Morat and others have emphasised the necessity of what's sometimes called Quebec de souche, old stock. And that marks a real contrast with the pluralistic discourse of political elites in Scotland, who have a relatively low threshold for inclusion. And I said that there's a kind of an instrumental logic to this. Of course there is. Scotland's population declined to an all-time low at the turn of the century. And what sustained it subsequently, what's got the levels of fertility up again, has been migration. In 2008, 2/3 of all newborn children in Scotland were to non-UK citizen parentage. So migrants have been sustaining population growth in Scotland. You know, on the dawn of this wonderful, shiny new parliament they had, they realised that they didn't have the population to sustain their nationalist project, or that it was in decline. And which is one of the sources of conflict between Holyrood and Westminster. Holyrood wants to have migration control. It wants to recruit more migrant labour to Scotland, whereas Westminster sees that as a backdoor into London. And elite political actors have been quite good at bringing minorities into governing parties. So this is Hamza Yousaf, who's widely tipped to be a future leader of the Scottish Nationalist Party. Not the next leader, that's probably Nicola Sturgeon, but a future leader. The SNP take great pride in saying that the first ethnic minority member of the Scottish Parliament was in their party, somebody called Bashir Ahmed, who passed away. And Alex Salmond wrote his obituary, which symbolically was quite important. Okay, so Scottish political elites express their nationalism as a political and not social matter, and certainly not as a matter of blood and soil. And whilst the distinction between civic and ethnic is self-evidently problematic, it makes sense why the late Bashir Ahmed, who was Scotland's first ethnic minority MSP, could confidently state, it's important where you come. It isn't important where you come from. What matters is where you're going together as a nation. Yet history self-evidently casts a shadow over contemporary expressions of nationhood in nearly all cases, and it's in relation to this in Scotland that we now turn. So Scottish political elites frequently invoke empire, and allied, but also separate to that, the history of Scotland as an emigrant sending nation in their discussion of pluralism. Now what's especially interesting for our discussion is a tension which Andy Mycock, my colleague at Huddersfield, picks up on. And he describes the ways in which national narratives, I quote, must remain largely positive and not dwell on the imperial sins of the past. So how then is Scotland's role in empire negotiated by political elites? Well, one prevailing trope, of which this is an illustration, is what we could describe as a kind of expeditionary proteophilia, an appetite for diversity born of searching it out over the centuries. This is a Liberal Democrat MSP. I think the more outward-looking you are, the more prepared you are to go out and experience different cultures and different societies, the more receptive probably your community is to that reverse process. It begins with a story of the Northwest Passage, the Antarctic whaling fleet, the Hudson Bay Company. So Scotland has served them with this kind of sense of what I call expeditionary proteophilia. But there's another illustration here, and this is from an SNP figure. She says, Scottish people broadly have a recognition of their part in the British Empire. When you've been part of that empire, you've been part of the Commonwealth as well, then you're part of a world society. So empire made us part of a world society, and you certainly have a responsibility for history. So it's evident, isn't it, that each focuses on the positive inheritance of empire, much as Mycroft predicts. It's also intriguing that neither unionist nor nationalist refuses ownership of empire. And I think that's important. Ownership of empire. I mean, obviously there's a persistently ambiguous tendency for recalling empire and decolonisation for Scottish politics, because it taps into a sociological contradiction which I want to come to in a second. But of course, remembering empire makes the nationalist project problematic because it fuses Scotland to England in the past. So Scotland's role in the empire occurred through membership of a union, and the Scots don't really want to kind of resurrect that. They want to move away from it. But this is a sociological contradiction. I think you'll enjoy this. When you do qualitative work with ethnic minorities in Scotland, and you get past the survey data, the blunt instrument, and you ask them, well, why do you identify so strongly with Scotland? What is the impulse there? What's going on? It's often common to hear, and in this particular study in Glasgow that I'm referring to, and I quote, and this is a quote from an Asian teenager. He says, Scots understand colonialism from their past history. They understand what ethnic minorities feel. So ethnic minorities in Scotland have to some extent internalised this Scottish narrative of being victims of empire. And it's quite reminiscent of how Bernie Grant would say, it would stick in my throat to call myself English. I call myself British because that includes other oppressed nations like the Welsh and the Scots. Now the tension, of course, has not gone unnoticed amongst critics, who often complain, and I quote, nationalists declare themselves the victims of colonialism, conveniently forgetting how many of them strutted around the colonies, barking orders at the natives and relishing their sundowners. That's Yasmin Albai-Brown in 2002. So there's certainly something interesting in how empire complicates the post-colonial dimension of secessionist nationalist discourses, specifically in highlighting this common imperial experience. And that inevitably limits the kind of manoeuvres, I think, that nationalist political actors are able to make. Okay, I want to skip across that. I want to go to talking about boundaries for integration. So this is the third and the final trope, really, which emerged from interview data with elite political actors. And it's what I've called boundaries of integration. Now, Will Kimlicker's argued, I think, quite persuasively, that multinational settlements are often only provisional in their accommodation of ethnic minority claims, suggesting that there's often a kind of a dissonance between the reasonable aspiration of immigrant minorities and the degree of willing accommodation by the nationalist level state, or the sub-state. Now I think there's a tangible expression of this in Scotland. Political elites frequently point to a number of boundaries for ensuring integration and pursuing unity. Two examples include the question of multilingualism and multi-faithism. Take the question of language first. Now the national language of Scotland is Gaelic, of which there are just under 60,000 speakers. In 2005, Gaelic was formally recognised as a national language of Scotland, which warranted equal treatment with English. Okay, there are about 300,000 speakers of Urdu and Punjabi, or just under 300,000 speakers of Urdu and Punjabi. So that's significantly a greater multiple. So when the question of bringing other languages into the fold is raised, which are more frequently spoken and often appear to be taking on very distinctive tones and content. Urdu and Punjabi in Scotland is not the Urdu and Punjabi which my parents spoke. It's taken on a real distinct kind of dialect, which is unique to Scotland. It's not spoken anywhere else in the world. There's consensus amongst respondents that Scottish Urdu and Scottish Punjabi could not warrant the status of one of the national languages. And this is a typical response. This is from Conservative MSP. Gaelic has a privileged position because of history. It's not really spoken anywhere else. Let's not get into this situation where we have sectioned off communities who can't communicate with people out of their own immediate society. I think that's very dangerous. So multilingualism becomes an issue of parallel societies. At the same time, application for citizenship in the UK includes you can sit the test in Scottish Gaelic if you want. You can sit the test in Welsh. It doesn't have to necessarily be English because it's one of the national languages. Now, in this assessment, historical multilingualism is a feature of national identity, where newer languages are deemed more fragmentary. I think a more charged example concerns the prospect for religious pluralism. Now, this might concern corporate recognition. The state funding of faith schools, for example, is a good illustration. Anything up to how, for example, the Irish in the past have got various kind of games as part of a Catholic settlement in Scotland. Now, this is a synopsis of responses I got to the idea that there should be Muslim-funded schools in Scotland which have parity with Presbyterian or other Christian schools, or indeed Catholic schools. And you get these myriad of responses which all kind of settle on the same kind of discursive trope. And broadly, I think it's brought out very well by my Green Party respondent, and he says, it would be extremely depressing to think that in 50 or 60 years' time, Muslims were no more integrated than that. There remain serious problems in terms of sectarianism and attitudes and prejudices against the Catholic community, and between the Catholic community and what you might call Protestants. But if we repeated those mistakes in terms of other ethnic groups and other religions, I think that would be very depressing. And I think there's very good reason to be cautious about simply seeking to mirror one settlement in the present with something from the past. But the clear danger for newer minorities is that their claims making becomes framed by these historical settlements. What's going on in all of this is these respondents are saying, we've got a problem with sectarianism in Scotland, and it's been a terrible blight on the political landscape. It's given rise to a great deal of violence and divided communities. Why would we want to add to that by recognising Muslims, Sikhs, Hindus in the same way? So what they've done, they've taken their historical experience and projected that onto future recognition. And that's the clear danger for new religious minorities, that it becomes framed by political elites within this register of historical sectarianism, rather than according to their own dynamics. Now, the latter, preferably, would occur within a democratic discourse, which makes explicit the grounds on which proposals are linked to identities, and hence opens up the space for debate and alternatives. In many respects, and this takes us back to that tension which I outlined at the beginning between multinationalism and multiculturalism, insofar as the sustainability of minority national projects in conditions of ethnic diversity places the two diversities into a hierarchy where historical minorities rest above. So, I guess just wrapping up with, this is just a picture from the Edinburgh Evening Mosque. I don't get much information on religious diversity in Scotland, and I saw this and I thought I'd put it up, and then I realised it's one of these stories. We're not terrorists, it's okay. So what can we say? Well, firstly, we know. What do we know? Well, we know Scottish nationhood is not premised on a self-evident ethnic category. In this respect, at least, it's civic. All the political actors aspire for a plural national identity. There's no ambiguity about that. They're not engaging in, there needs to be an old Scottish stock, you need to have a Scottish name. None of that. So that marks them out in contrast to other minority national projects. But there is, as elite actors betray, this kind of historical hierarchy which is implicitly mapped onto newer minorities. Our historical experience of sectarianism means that new religious minorities might be subject to the same condition. And that ultimately leaves me then with that question, does Scotland need a more multicultural conception of multinationalism, which is something raised by Will Kemp? I'll stop there. Thank you very much for listening.